Welcome to Then and Now, brought to you by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We are dedicated to studying change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every week, we interview thought leaders, historians, researchers, and policymakers about what happened then and what that means for us now. Welcome to Then and Now, a new podcast sponsored by the Luskin Center for History and Policy at UCLA. I'm Katherine Marino. I teach in the UCLA History Department, and I'm a friend of the Luskin Center. The goal of the center is to bring the past into conversation with the present, and in doing so to understand how we got where we are so that we can imagine alternative and better futures. Our guest today is Leandra Zarnow, assistant professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas, where she teaches about U.S. women's history and women's gender and sexuality studies more broadly, and about U.S. politics, law, and social movements. Recently, Leandra Zarnow published an excellent biography of Bella Abzug called Battling Bella, The Protest Politics of Bella Abzug. It came out in November with Harvard University Press, and this biography explores the life and work of the larger-than-life lawyer, three-term U.S. representative from New York, and feminist leader Bella Abzug during the height of her influence from 1968 to 1976. Zarnow says that in her day, Abzug was the most recognizable woman in politics. And at a time when only 14 of the 435 House members were women, she was also really one of the most recognizable figures in the 1970s. She was well known for her wide-brimmed hats that became her trademark, but she was also a really diligent behind-the-scenes organizer who took bold and important political stances. Zarnow's biography explores the social justice and feminist politics that motivated her career, exploring her deep roots in Jewish, feminist, pacifist, and anti-racist organizing. And in so doing, Leandra Zarnow really positions Bella Abzug as a forerunner of today's resistance politics that we've really seen in the wake of the 2016 presidential election emerge, and as a precursor to the political leaders like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and other women in Congress who've been pushing the Democratic Party to the left. As we speak today, June 11th, 2020, in the midst of a historical conjuncture of social movement, resistance, protests against police brutality and anti-Black violence sweeping the nation and the world, and in a pivotal election year in which women are running in record numbers for U.S. Congress and statewide elections, it's a particularly important time to remember this history of Bella Abzug. So Professor Zarnow, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Katherine. First off, I just want to have, on a personal note, mention that Katherine was in graduate school at Stanford University when I was a postdoc. And so it's really a thrill to be on Then and Now with you and with Katherine's acclaimed book, Feminism for the Americas, also recently out. So I hope we, connect upon our research that is definitely intertwined. So Bella Abzug really was a legend in my family. I grew up in Southern California, in Escondido, actually. And for my parents, who were quite progressive-minded, politically active people, she loomed large. And my father actually, by chance, marched in the 1970 Women's Strike for Equality, where he heard Bella Abzug speak. He had been visiting relatives in New York City, and they were members of NOW, and they basically strong-armed him to join their demonstration, but it wasn't very hard to do so because he was an organizer for Students for Democratic Society in the Vietnam Vets Against the War. My mother also went to Evergreen in Washington and was part of a cooperative there, and also involved in anti-domestic violence work working at a shelter early on. So they definitely followed in this progressive tradition that Bella Abzug was a major figure. Bella Abzug passed away in 1998. That was my second year at Smith College, and I worked at the Sophia Smith Collection, which is an incredible women's history archive, and helped prepare the Gloria Steinem papers for public researchers. And so as a second year student, basically I was putting in alphabetical order correspondence A through Z, and happened to come across one letter that was signed Bella. And this collection had already been picked over for notables. So this was quite a discovery. And I thought it was just really interesting to have this really personal note between Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem. I really forgot about her, though, until I started graduate school at UC Santa Barbara, and I was in hot pursuit of a dissertation topic. And so in those days, in the early 2000s, what do? You go to the library and you go to the stacks. And I looked at the HQ section, which is a designation for women's studies, and I looked for any book that caught my eye. And a title jumped out at me, What Women Want. So I had to pick it off the shelf, and I discovered the 1977 National Women's Conference, which was initially, intriguing to me. Didn't know that Marjorie Sproul was writing her book on this conference at the time. And thought I was going to write about the conference, but soon became enthralled by Bella Abzug, who was the presiding officer of this conference. And I found out that it was one of her last and greatest acts in Congress. She was a 3-term Congress woman in the early 70s. And one of her last acts was to shepherd through the law that designated the federal funding for this conference and set the planning wheels in motion. And so for those of you who don't know about the Women's Conference, it was the only federal women's conference in U.S. history and the most diverse gathering of American women to that point. So this was quite a feat to accomplish. Brought in over 150,000 people that were officially involved at state and territorial meetings, and then 2,000 delegates came to Houston, where I now teach, and descended upon the city in November 1977 to basically fulfill the legal obligation through this policy to pass a national plan of action that was presented to President Jimmy Carter in 1978. And so this was the U.S. answer to the United Nations International Women's Year Initiative and the large gathering that happened in Mexico City in 1975. And the United States was among the few nations who didn't have a conference before 1975. And so we wanted to make sure that we would set the tone for a human rights agenda afterwards. Right. Gloria Steinem calls this.
I just wanted to jump in because I wanted to sort of help refresh also readers or listeners' memories and understandings of how significant Abzug's work in Congress even before this pivotal conference was. And I love hearing about your personal connection, Abzug, and the fascinating ways in which your life intertwined with her, and the book spoke to you about the 77 conference, and that's how you decided to write this. I mean, it's helpful to think about the early 70s when you point out she was a congresswoman. This was this moment of transformative legal and legislative change in terms of women's rights. Abzug is known for her quip, "We put sex discrimination provisions into everything." So you have Title IX coming out at that time. Congress is passing the Equal Pay Act, the ERA. Could you just tell us a little bit about what you deem to be some of Abzug's most important accomplishments in this period?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely leaded with the National Women's Conference because I do see that as one of her kind of crowning achievements in Congress.
Right.
But she came in really as a feminist trailblazer who reshaped the path for women in politics thereafter. And she ran on the slogan, "A woman's place is in the House of Representatives."
Right.
She really thought, she modeled her life as an intersectional life that she lived, and she was passionate for full throttle advocacy of social justice. Feminism was part of a larger package of interests that included economic justice, gay civil rights, environmentalism, kind of bringing resources back to urban spaces. So this is really a full intersectional purpose. And she came to the, feminist movement organically, and really started to incorporate the passions and the interests of women's liberation into her program that I would say primarily was, focused actually on ending the war in Vietnam and on economic justice issues first. So gender comes into play as a result of, the buoyancy of the women's liberation movement and the impact it had on her. and also a longstanding interest in intersectional interest in gender rights that she also, put to the foreground in the disarmament movement, where she really came out of. So she pushed for gender parity and peace, prior to this point. So I would say that if you're thinking about her, largest accomplishments, she was a forerunner in Congress in leading a legal feminist, program that focused on equal pay for equal work. It focused on universal childcare as a goal. It focused on a guaranteed income for all people. Really thought about equal having women gain opportunities to have their own credit cards and their bank accounts, so economic independence. She really thought about all of the different ways in which the law was, in fact, discriminatory towards women. And so 1970s is really a landmark moment for women's rights legislation that I would say is the gender equivalent of what we saw for racial civil rights in the early 1960s with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Right.
Thank you. And that is such a profound part of the book's argument, is that Abzug was really both pivotal in making this movement happen, and also that she really did demonstrate this intersectional feminist and legal vision that was ahead of its time. And you point out also how many of Abzug's goals that were deemed radical were really blueprints of sorts for activists today. Getting back to the intersectionality and the way that she came to sort of thinking through issues around gender intersectionally, I wondered if you could talk to us about her defense of Willie McGee in the early 1950s. You wrote a great prize-winning article about this called "Braving Jim Crow to Save Willie McGee, Bella Abzug, the Legal Left and Civil Rights Innovation." I think it's particularly relevant in this moment we're in right now. Could you just explain what this case was and why Abzug's role in it was important?
Sure. Thank you, Katherine, for asking about this. I think, as many of us have really been trying to come to grips with George Floyd's death this past week, I've been thinking a lot about the Willie McGee case. This history of lynching is such a fraught and disgusting part of our history that continues. And I think the prevalence of police brutality in the 21st century would have devastated but not surprised Bella Abzug. So in this Willie McGee case, she was in her late 20s, a really green lawyer, and she made the remarkable choice of traveling to the South for the first time to represent Willie McGee. Willie McGee was an African-American veteran who had been accused of raping a white woman named Willetta Hawkins, and talk of the town was that they were engaged in an extramarital affair. This is a he said, she said case. There's a lot of holes in the legal record, but Bella Abzug truly believed that her client was innocent. And McGee's first trial ended with a guilty verdict delivered in 2.5 minutes in Mississippi, which meant death by electric chair for African-American men. So she was recruited to go down and find local counsel for a retrial, which did not end much better than his first trial. And subsequently, she defended Willie McGee on a team of lawyers during his appeal. And what I found so surprising was that she brought gender into the civil rights defense as much as race. And so she argued that rape law was misused to police the sexual color line. And she presented this kind of gendered argument. At the same time, she presented a race-based argument that noted through statistics that she had researched that African-American men faced unequal sentencing in rape cases. So this was huge for Abzug. It was her first chance to argue, or she thought she was hoping to game to argue at the Supreme Court. They decided not to actually listen to the case, but the case became known the world over, not unlike George Floyd's case. And at the same time, for Abzug personally, she faced her first death threat. She faced a miscarriage during the case when shortly thereafter she had stayed up all night in a bus stall waiting to defend Willie McGee the next day because no hotels would house her. And the Willie McGee case really filled the first pages of her very extensive FBI file. So McGee was executed in May 1951. It's tragically, you can actually listen to the execution that aired as if a sporting event on a local newscast. And so there was an excellent story by NPR's Radio Diaries a few years back that has a clip of the tape if you're interested in knowing more about it. This was a legal lynching. And, Bella Abzug was actually not on the scene during the execution because she made one last-ditch legal maneuver to stall the execution. This death shook her to the core. She hung his portrait in her home. She told her staff about it during Congress. She reflected in an oral history. I realized that there was something so terribly, terribly wrong with our democracy. Mm. How does it connect later to what she did in Congress and thereafter? Well, I want to actually go past Congress and talk about when she ran for mayor in 1977 in New York City. And she was leading in the polls until the blackout and looting that happened that summer. And she advocated for an overhaul of the criminal justice and policing system to focus on rehabilitation over imprisonment and to pour resources back into neighborhood social services and looting. So we kind of hear the remnants of that kind of response to these types of skirmishes that we've been seeing in the last couple of weeks. Unfortunately, she really shifted and went down in the polls after that point, and her longtime nemesis in Congress, Ed Koch, won that election, championing a law and order style crackdown. Mm-hmm. So I think that is something that we should remember.
Absolutely. Thank you for drawing those connections. It's really so important and relevant today. I want to also touch on a history that I think few people know about, who are not historians at least, is the fact that she was really instrumental in pushing childcare legislation through Congress, but then it was actually vetoed by Nixon. And in this moment today, when all sorts of activists are calling for childcare legislation, pointing out the way that the U.S. falls behind globally in terms of being one of the few countries that does not have such legislation. Just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. Bella Abzug really depended on childcare. She had an African-American woman named Alice Williams who lived with her since her daughters were in their infancy. And that was that kind of labor that was provided to her, this reproductive labor essentially, was the reason that Bella Abzug was able to be a working mother and forge a career as a cause lawyer. And she was very aware of that. She brought child care support into her campaign headquarters. So anyone who was volunteering there could drop off their children on the second floor of her first campaign headquarters and all of them thereafter. So it was a no-brainer for her to team up with Shirley Chisholm, Representative Shirley Chisholm of Brooklyn, who was really the initial driving force in Congress on the child care issue. And so they together, pursued a comprehensive child care bill. But there were other advocates too. Marian Wright Edelman, for instance, was a longstanding child care advocate and had also lobbied on this issue. And so, this was a really comprehensive grassroots effort to get child care onto the national agenda and then passed through, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, only to be vetoed by Nixon. So that was a very devastating loss. And I think that it's important for us when we're thinking about legal feminism in the 1970s to really evaluate the losses as much as the gains in the legal infrastructure at the time. And so, this is one area that we can really see the longstanding impact on our workplace. Right. In terms of equal pay for equal work, in terms of the feminization of poverty, and the level of college-educated women who opt out because they're weighing the child care costs against their the take-home pay that they would have. And I think that this is Bella Abzug saw this inequity developing. She saw this happening as more and more women came into the workforce during and after World War II, and really wanted our nation to model itself after some of the social democratic states that she really idealized, from Scandinavian nations to her beloved Israel.
Right. And I appreciate your emphasis on, the failures as well as the accomplishments. I mean, one of the things also that did not ultimately succeed or was ratified was the Equal Rights Amendment, of course. And, there's this FX miniseries, Mrs. America, and I hope everyone reads your great op-ed in the Washington Post about what the show, misses and what it gets right. About Bella Abzug's role. It really looks at this ERA battle, and it focuses on this rise of a new right that was led in many ways by these foot soldiers of Phyllis Schlafly, and this political realignment that emerged at that moment. And I want to sort of jump forward now to look at the lasting role that Abzug played in terms of establishing a role for women in politics, but also the fact that we still have so much work to do there. So, you talk about in addition to the constant challenges she faced as a trailblazer in the sexism she was constantly experiencing, she nonetheless worked tirelessly to bring women into politics. She founded the National Women's Political Caucus, which really worked to help women come into political office and especially into democratic politics. In 1971, that caucus predicted that half of the members of Congress would be women by 2020. And today there are 26 women in the US Senate, so 26%, and women are 23.2% of US representatives. Why do you think political change has happened so slowly here?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I do think, going back to Mrs. America, that it's really great that Hollywood is starting to draw focus to the period of the 1970s and reintroduce this period that was so pivotal, for women. I have heard from activists involved in NOW and the National Women's Political Caucus and other organizations that they are upset about the lopsided treatment in the show and feel that the grassroots or energy of feminists is not being equally portrayed to the really effective mass mobilization of Schlafly's Stockberry Eagle Forum followers.
Yes, absolutely. I've heard that too. It's almost like we need another version of the show that now goes into the feminist grassroots work.
Yeah, exactly. I'm hoping that I really think the show invites Hollywood to create fuller portraits of the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s. And I think that I've been hearing a few, buzzes for that potentially happening. But what we can see through the show, on the one hand is that, as we've pushed for gender parity, there really is this ideologically diverse, group of American women. And we have to be mindful that, parity does not strongly move directly towards a progressive, future, as some feminists, I think, perhaps naively, suggest. We can also see, I think, that a lot of the issues of the 60s and 70s are unresolved. And so why do we have the, Me Too movement, for instance? Well, clearly, women in the 1970s named sexual harassment and brought it to attention, but they didn't wipe out all of the structural and cultural, kind of barriers and discriminatory practices that allow it to persist. So we still need family leave policies. We have to deal with poverty, feminized poverty, criminal justice, policing, et cetera. So the 70s is often seen as an era of limits, but also I think it's a really expansive protest movement that we can draw focus back to as well. So to your question on, why has political change happened so slowly? I think that what we're seeing is that the suffrage, especially in the suffrage centennial, we can focus on how the voting power that was achieved did not easily equate to political power. And so for much of the 20th century, the numbers of women coming into Congress really only jumped every midterm from 1 or 2 to at most 4%. Here's another sober reality. There were less women in Congress at the end of the 1970s than there were at the beginning of the 1960s. So this is not always a forward march. And I think that political power has been very reluctantly conveyed. And actually, there's a collection that I co-edited with Stacey Toronto that's coming out this summer with Johns Hopkins Press called Suffrage at 100, and about 20 plus historians are commenting on and thinking about how we shift from voting power to political power and the implications of this slow march and uneven path to political power that has occurred since 1920. So we really make the case in our introduction that the U.S. has and still favors a male political leadership ideal. So when we close our eyes at night and we imagine the president, we do not imagine, the incredible range of candidates that we saw in the Democratic primaries. Our default still is male leadership. Mm-hmm. And so we can't see a woman pass the VP position, which is, a second in command. And we've really, I think, pigeonholed women in politics into the domain of women's issues. And so this is the catch-22 for women. They use maternalism as a wedge into electoral politics, but it stifled their ability to break out of this mold.
And by maternalism, for people who may not know that term?
Yeah, so thinking about issues of motherhood issues, caring about our children, thinking about education, thinking about issues that are deemed feminine in our politics versus foreign affairs, which is, kind of traditionally seen as a male domain. And so we're, I think needing to really think about that. What lessons could Bella Abzug offer? She was very interested in having women be seen holistically as candidates. And so for her, ending the Vietnam War was the end-all be-all issue. In fact, some of her staffers would get annoyed with her because she would prioritize that over what they saw as women's rights, should be the priority. So she would have, kind of some scuffles with staff because she felt that the umbrella issue was ending the Vietnam War. So this holistic candidacy and really trying to present women outside the narrowing space of women's issues was really important to her. She would also want to cultivate women in every aspect of the political arena. And so, she was one of the co-founders, as you mentioned, of the National Women's Political Caucus. And there really wasn't any organization like that until 1971. And so now we have like Emily's List and She Should Run and all of these different organizations that cultivate women as candidates. But Bella Abzug's, really, once she got into politics, once she campaigned for the first time, realized how unequal the infrastructure was in supporting, women providing patronage to women as, potential candidates. And so the fundraising schemes, the mentoring schemes in the two major the Democratic and the Republican Party were just not available to women. So the National Women's Political Caucus, created that infrastructure. And so anyways, Bella Abzug would certainly tell women to keep running, but to keep building and cultivating these infrastructures to channel women into politics, to make them prepared for the political stage. I think we're making headway in politics where we have strong movement leaders, we have strong change makers, but she would want to also have us continue to be adept, crafty operators at the grassroots level too. She studied structures and rules of institutions so that she would know how best to navigate, bend, and break them. She was also a great communicator, using media and her voice to her advantage. I mean, she had difficulties in the press for sure, hurtful, slanderous coverage, but she also strongly championed the freedom of the press. And she believed in public dissent and watchdog oversight as essential mechanisms of democracy. So her vision was beyond gender. It was really about a full, representative, open, just, transparent democracy. And putting
also relevant for this particular moment we're in. Absolutely. And I think as a biographer, one of my big interests, is thinking about how did she frame her political philosophy? What kinds of tactics did she use? What worked, what didn't? How do you make that shift from, as she saw it, bringing protest to power? I feel like those are timeless concerns for social movement activists. And I think that it's important for us as historians to provide these stories as really a usable past. Absolutely. I mean, I really appreciate your underscoring the work, that trailblazing work she did with the National Women's Political Caucus in terms of, fundraising and laying institutional groundwork for those really important organizations like Emily's List, and just the sort of plotting behind the scenes work that's necessary to get women into political office, but also the real breadth of her vision that incorporated, as you have talked about before, not just gender politics and feminism, but issues around sexuality, around LGBTQ rights, around anti-racism, ending the Vietnam War, and also these bigger structural issues of how you bring protest into politics. So as a sort of concluding question, you've talked about what lessons we can learn. Wondered if you could expand a little bit on, this moment when we are seeing this erosion of democratic principles, erosion of freedom of the press, resurgence of white supremacist activism and policies, anti-immigration, anti-LGBTQ, anti-feminist politics and policies, as well as a real renewed resurgence in protest and a pushing of the Democratic Party, from the left with these people, especially with women in Congress. So how do you think Abzug would respond to this moment, and what words of advice might she have for us?
Yeah, I mean, I started this book in the early 2000s, as I said, and so it's kind of seen multiple administrations from the Bush years through Obama and now this Trump era.
Right.
And so it's been very interesting to think about the different modes in Bella Abzug's life that speak to, all kinds of different times. One area of her work that I think gets really undervalued, and in my opinion is one of her biggest contributions, is the area of civil liberties. And so she, defended a lot of people that were caught up in the McCarthy anti-communist probes, and were, unionists and racial minorities and political dissenters, immigrants, women, who were deemed un-American in that time period. And she really came back to that work when she was in Congress during and after the Watergate scandal. And she was one of the early voices in Congress demanding the impeachment of President Richard Nixon. And so, especially during our recent impeachment, that really came back to me, and thinking about that work. And so she ran as a chairwoman the Committee of the Government Information and Individual Rights. And basically, they oversaw the implementation of the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act. So in the mid-1970s, really building on the momentum of the Watergate scandal unfolding, Congress passed a Privacy Act for the first time, and also added teeth to the Freedom of Information Acts that, first were established in the 1960s. And so these laws were still in their infancy, and essentially the Abzug Committee, so she had a lot of legal staff, taught Americans how to file document requests with agencies under these two acts. And we now think about FOIA requests as a basic tool of democracy that lawyers use, that average Americans use, that the press uses. So I think that's a really important, kind of not flashy, contribution. And, thinking about Americans' privacy rights and the right to know, or bringing truth to power, I think is something that we absolutely have to focus on in this particular moment. The levels of surveillance, the focus on new technologies. I think that this element of her work is something to really hone in on. Additionally, the new politics moment of the late 60s and early 70s. So there was an insurgent Democratic force within the Democratic Party to bring movement activism, movement energy into the Democratic Party, and to basically challenge the establishment at that time, which was Cold War liberals and Southern Democrats. And I think that because we focus so much on a conservative ascendancy from the 1970s forward, we forget that actually there was a progressive force that was very strong in the late 60s and early 70s and shifted the agenda and changed the look, the face of the Democratic Party by democratizing it. And we're back there again.
Thank you. That's a very hopeful note on which to conclude. But I really want to thank you for drawing our attention to this issue of government accountability and transparency. I found that section where you talk about her role with behind the Freedom of Information Act to be such a fascinating part of your book. And want to just reinforce again what a fabulous biography this is, and one that is so vital to read right now with all of these issues that we've been talking about today being front and center. So thank you so much, Professor Zarnow, for your time. It was great to talk with you. Then and Now is a production of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy with support from the UCLA History Department. It can be found on Spotify and Apple Podcast. Let us know your thoughts on this or other episodes of Then and Now by emailing us at luskincenter@history.ucla.edu. Special thanks to our executive producer, Maya Ferdman, and to David Myers, the director of the Luskin Center for History and Policy. And special thanks again to Leandra Zarnow, author of Battling Bella, The Protest Politics of Bella Abzug with Harvard University Press.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us this week on Then and Now. Then and Now is brought to you by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, where we study change to make change. For more on our work, follow us on Twitter and Facebook at our handle, @LuskinHistory. Our show is produced by Maya Ferdman and David Myers, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.